Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today is the third and the last day of the PF risk assessment sessions, sharing the outcomes with public and private sector. And today, our intention is to give you some insights on the outcomes to the journey of 2 years in conducting the PF risk assessment. Introducing myself, my name is Ahmed Al-Falasi, Director of Targeted Financial Sanctions at the EOCN. So alongside me, a team of experts from EOCN and K2. We have been in this journey for 2 years now, and in the presentation, the team will shed light to the scoping, methodology, and all the factors that came into the outcomes and sharing it with you. The reason why we wanted to have this session is basically to bring into the attention to both public and private sector the outcomes where these can be articulated into your internal procedures and policies for sustainable activity of doing business. So we understand there are some threats, vulnerabilities, and how these mitigation measures should be put in place so that you guys can have a better way of doing business, having safety in place, compliance, knowledge, what are the red flags, what are the typologies, and in line with the international best practices set by the FATF, and what are the upcoming rounds of mutual evaluation reports. As an assessor, it's very important to share these outcomes with you guys. We have very important role in transparency and starting point, the risk and context of the country. And in this line, we will be working closely with regulators and private sector so that you guys are aware, understand how to benefit from these and to reflect it internally. And in the next round of MER, it's not quite far from now. So next year we'll be having the technical compliance, TC Annex, to the FATF Secretariat. And then the following year, the assessors will be coming to the country to assess the AML-CFT framework. So we wanted to work on different fronts, having a better, clear understanding of risk and context, and then moving how we can provide you guys with red flags, typologies, that will allow you to understand what are the most prominent ways that proliferators or illicit activities are being subject to abuse, either directly or indirectly. So without further ado, I will shift to the experts so that they can introduce themselves and guide you throughout the outcomes, and hopefully the outcomes will reflect according to the methodology conducted by both experts, EOCN and K2. And thank you very much for attending here in person, and for our viewers online, wishing you all the best, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. My name is Ladan Archin. I'm with K2 Integrity, along with my colleague Elias Alfiya and Dave Lambden, who is, Elias and I come from the United States, and Dave is in Abu Dhabi, stationed in Abu Dhabi. We also have other members of our team who are not here, who have been working or have had the honor of working with EOCN on this endeavor, which has lasted 2 years, which we'll go through in a bit. Today's session, we're going to discuss first the PFNRA purpose, the scope and methodology, and my colleagues at EOCN are going to discuss the outcomes of the UAE PFRA and the recommendations that came from that. So the purpose of the PFNRA is encapsulated into two main FATF, Financial Action Task Force standards and methodologies, two core issues. The first core issue 11.2, basically the purpose sees the purpose of the PFRA as how well does the country understand, identify, assess, and understand, and also mitigate the risk of potential breaches, evasion, or non-implementation of obligations regarding targeted financial sanctions related to the financing of proliferation in the country in higher and lower risk scenarios. Proliferation being the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, whether they're chemical, biological, or nuclear. The second core issue, it's core issue 11.5, is to what extent do financial institutions, designated non-financial businesses and professions, or DNFBPs, and virtual asset service providers, or VASPs, comply with and understand their obligations regarding targeted financial sanctions when it comes to proliferation financing. A PF risk assessment, like other risk assessments, tries to help the country identify, assess, and ultimately understand how to mitigate those and address those risks, in this case, PF risks. And once you understand the risks through this process of the national risk assessment, the country will be able to set concrete goals for how to address those risks and to develop policies for and to deploy resources by supervisors, law enforcement, and other competent authorities to address those goals, and to assist in determining the appropriate level and nature of AML-CFT controls that are applied to a particular sector or product. As we mentioned, this process took 2 years, started in the second quarter of 2022, which was our preliminary scoping. We scoped it, and we'll talk a little bit about the scope of this project, and then identified the key stakeholders at that time, public and private sector, you being part of the private sector, and then provided surveys and distributed the surveys. That was data requests, which is beyond the surveys, which we'll talk about, for information that was used to analyze the risk. Those were sent out in the third and fourth quarter of 2022. Upon receiving the results of the surveys and the data that we gathered, interviews were conducted, and we'll talk about how many and such, to delve deeper into the responses to the questionnaires and surveys. After all of those were collated, started analyzing the data and doing the actual risk assessment in collaboration with the public sector after we reported the draft, and we're able to consult with them in terms of the findings, the preliminary findings, and then finalize the report. Last quarter, the third quarter of 2024, the National Committee on AML-CFT approved the PFNRA and its executive summary, and this quarter we're EOCN is going to disseminate the public version, or what they call the sanitized version of the PFNRA, and conduct training programs through the end of the year. So the scope of the NRA is centered around two recommendations of the FATF, recommendations 1 and 7. Recommendation 1 is, it talks about how it's incumbent upon all countries to conduct a national risk assessment. Up until about 2.5 years ago, that requirement only centered around AML-CFT. And about 2-3 years ago, proliferation financing was added to the list of risks that had to be considered for the national risk assessment. And we'll talk about the guidance that FATF issued after that as well. And then recommendation 7, that basically talks about the risk exposure of the country to the breach, non-implementation, and evasion of targeted financial sanctions when it comes to proliferation financing. Another thing about the scope of recommendation 7, in 2022, when we started this process, recommendation 7 was focused on 2 UN Security Council resolutions, UNSCR 1718 regarding North Korea, and UNSCR 2231 regarding Iran. UNSCR 2231 had been kind of watered down from its previous version that talked about proliferation financing in general in Iran and Iran's proliferation activities. But after the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, that was reduced to just 2231, focused on just UAVs, drones, and missile activities of Iran. So we started, and the focus of this, the scope of this PFNRA was centered around risks posed by DPRK and Iran. On October 18th of 2023, 2231 sunsetted, and it wasn't renewed for various reasons within the UN Security Council, political activities, mostly by Russia and China. So, however, both UAE and other countries have decided that the risks, PF risks, that Iran poses have not gone away, despite the fact that nor for missiles and drones and other delivery measures of proliferation, those have not gone away, and so that focus continued. And so those are the risks that, in terms of geography, that we're considering. In terms of the methodology, as I mentioned, the FATF had, as of 3 years ago, added proliferation financing to the list of risks that have to be taken into consideration for providing a national risk assessment. They issued a guidance on proliferation financing national risk assessments, and that was in 2021, and that is the main guiding document from which the methodology of this PFNRA is based on. However, it incorporated other documents and other guidances, such as the one for the Royal United Service Institute, or RUSI, as well as King's College of London and other organizations such as Brookings. CNAS had also discussed typologies, as well as the UN panel of experts that provided typologies and information that was relevant, as well as the staff expertise, our own K2, as well as EOCN expertise on proliferation financing, as well as conducting national risk assessments. So it was a hybrid bespoke methodology that was used for this PFNRA. The NRA in general, the PFNRA, the methodology is used to understand the threats and vulnerabilities with proliferation financing in the UAE and the mitigating measures and controls that are used to address those risks. In terms of what this means, threats are defined by the FATF as designated persons and entities that have previously caused or have the potential to evade, breach, or impede the implementation, or exploit the failure to implement PFTFS in the past, present, or the future. It can also refer to or it can be caused by persons or entities that act on behalf of designated persons or entities. Vulnerabilities refer to matters that can be exploited by the threat or that may support or facilitate the breach, non-implementation, or evasion of PF-related targeted financial sanctions. And those vulnerabilities and threats provide the risk, and the mitigating measures and controls are the measures and controls that are used to address those risks. So when we put together the methodology, we identified the threats to be divided into three main categories. The first being financial products directly related to trade in PF-sensitive goods. The second was revenue-raising activities, and the third was financial and corporate structures to support movement of finances and cash. And each of these three were divided into various threat factors, all adding up to 26. And basically what this is saying is that PF threats are divided into basically trade finance related threats, revenue-raising activities, or raising revenue to provide for this, and then financial and corporate structures to support those those activities. And we'll discuss those a little bit more further on. And then vulnerabilities, we found they're divided into 5 main categories: legal and institutional factors, legal persons and arrangements, geographic and environmental factors, social and political factors, economic and technological factors, and each of these vulnerabilities have various factors, adding up to 18. We assigned specific weights to each of these factors and each of these categories that encapsulated or addressed the impact and the significance of each of these factors and categories in the UAE context. So, for example, in the threats, the first category, financial products, or basically trade finance related to PF sensitive goods, had the highest weight with its sub-factors, and the revenue raising and financial and corporate structures had equal weight almost. And then with vulnerabilities, the highest was geographic and environmental factors, and as well as economic and technological factors. Those were the highest contributors, had the highest weight in terms of their impact on vulnerabilities. Then we looked at mitigating measures and controls at the jurisdictional level. They were divided into 7 main categories: registration, company formation, supervision, prioritization and commitment, mitigating sanctions evasions risk at the national level, export controls, domestic and international cooperation, and then law enforcement and judicial powers. Each of these were divided into several factors, and each of these categories and factors had weights as well in terms of their impact on mitigating PF risk. The information gathering part of the PFNRA, or any NRA, takes the longest time, and it's, the sources are basically public sector, which are supervisory authorities, law enforcement, UAE FIU, export control agencies, and local registrars. On the private sector side, financial institutions, designated non-financial businesses and persons, DNFBPs, you guys, and virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. These groups had different sets of surveys unique to them that was sent out to all those involved, and we'll talk about how many. So these surveys had both, and I assume you also received this, had multiple choice question and answers, and and then they had questions that were more free form, and these were both, in terms of those surveys, they were both provided us with quantitative as well as qualitative type of information. And the interviews we conducted were the same. We delved deeper into the surveys and the answers that were provided, which gave us qualitative and quantitative measures for analyzing the data. We also got case studies from the authorities, as well as international reports that provided both case studies and incidents reports, as well as open source information that was out there, and consultation with experts that are known for their expertise in proliferation financing. In terms of the quantitative data, the case studies, the surveys themselves, the amount of frozen and confiscated goods, and the number of SARs and STRs also provided us with quantitative data, as well as some other data that we received. The surveys, we sent out 38 surveys to various supervisory authorities and local registrars and conducted 20 interviews. And then to law enforcement agencies, 7 sets of surveys were sent out and 3 interviews conducted. With export control agencies, 14 sets of surveys were sent out to different export control agencies and 8 interviews were conducted. Within the private sector, 145 FIs received surveys and 31 sets of interviews were conducted. 800 DNFBPs out of, I believe it's 19,000 or so, 29,000 DNFBPs received surveys by their supervisors, from us through the supervisors, and 11 sets of interviews were conducted. And the 5 VASPs that were registered at the time of this data collection received those surveys, and 1 set of interview, both virtual and in person, was conducted. The timeline for this, we had to put an ending time or a time limit for collecting data, because we could keep collecting data and the data would change, was the end of September of 2023. So when we went about analyzing the data, we, and this is industry practice, had 5 measures of scoring the risk: low, medium, high, and high. And each of these were given a numerical range, 0 being the low, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5 was high. And within that range, as we said, we did this analysis both quantitatively with numbers assigned, as well as use what tools we had that I talked about previously to qualitatively analyze the data and be able to input that qualitative analysis as well. And before I go back, I just wanted to say these threats that we had, each of those had a weight, as I mentioned, and the sub-factors had weights as well in terms of the significance and impact, both threats, vulnerabilities, and mitigating measures. And the risk score, combined with the weight of it, gave you a final amount of what the threat would be. Same with vulnerabilities. So you would take the threats, each with its own weights, and scored each one for each of the sectors and subsectors. That provided you with a measure of the threats, weighted risk score that you got. And then for mitigating measures and controls, there were 4 categories: non-existent, weak, partially effective, and effective. Again, with the weights given to each of those categories I had mentioned before on mitigating measures, each of them had various weights. Each of these categories and the sub-factors had weights that again measured the impact of those mitigating measures. And we went and gave each of those sectors, the mitigating measures, controls, a risk score that was weighted and provided us with the risk score for a weighted risk score for the mitigating measures and controls. The methodology consisted of, as I said, providing threats and vulnerabilities. When we came up with a risk score for the threats and the vulnerabilities, that gave us the measure of inherent risk, meaning the risk that is unmitigated, raw risk. And in here, vulnerabilities are things that you have less mitigating measures against, like, for example, geographic factors. UAE is where it is, with its proximity to a country of PF concern, which is Iran. It is in the middle of its proximity to the Strait of Hormuz means that it's a major trade and transshipment hub, and it's a huge financial center in the region and internationally. So that provides vulnerabilities that the country has, as well as the threats that we had discussed in terms of what those factors are. That provides, the threats and the vulnerabilities provide the UAE with a picture of where the inherent risk is, and we can discuss, the EOCN is going to discuss the amount, which is the unmitigated inherent risk that the country, PF risk that it faces. You take into account the mitigating measures and controls at the national level, which will provide you with a residual risk. And that is indicative of where the country was and the data that we collected as of the end of September of last year. Many things have changed since then, and the next set of PFNRA in a few years will have a different outcome. But is there something you wanted to add on?
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So 2 things that I wanted to comment here and to share, because I believe we haven't said this in other sessions, but we actually, taking all the threats and the vulnerabilities and the mitigating controls, we also took into account 13 sectors of the economy, which are, I'm just going to name them, which are the international mainland banks, international banks who are in the financial free zones, large and regional domestic banks in the mainland, small to medium also banks who are in the mainland. We also took into account VASPs, the virtual assets services providers, MSBs, money service businesses, asset managers and the securities sector, registered Hawala providers, insurance companies, and that's for the relevant insurance companies, not all, and that's from the financial sector. From the DNFBP sector, which is your sector, we took into account TCSPs, which is trust and company service providers, or company service providers, I think some may refer to. Also lawyers. Also dealers in precious metals and stones, the DPMS, and also, and we bucketed into a separate category the other types of DNFBPs, which were also assessed. So taking into account all of the hundreds of threats, vulnerabilities, mitigating factors, and multiply that by the 13 sectors that we analyzed, I think that we had more than 3,000 variables to assess from, right? So that means that the information that we got is so into depth that we're talking about centesimal points, right? So that is just to give you just like a brief description of how into depth the national risk assessment went. And the second thing that has to do with what you can see in your screen here is the equation of risks. Here we see that threats and vulnerabilities, when they are put together, conform the inherent risk. And then the inherent risk is mitigated by your controls and equals the residual risk. So, but as you may know, the FATF also includes another component, which is the consequences, right? So the consequences in this case we did not take into account because at the national level, the consequences of proliferation financing are just severe, right? Are too dire to contemplate. So everything here, the consequences are taking as the most severe, but we didn't include that into the equation of the methodology because of what I just explained. But that doesn't mean that when you are conducting your own institutional risk assessment, you should not take consequences into account. On the contrary, you should take the consequences as a part of the equation of risk, because for you, the consequences are multiple, right? At the national level are severe, are people getting weapons of mass destruction, which is, catastrophe for everyone. But in your level, you might have, for example, compliance consequences, right? Sanctions, penalties. You might have reputational risk consequences. You might have, every other, for example, for financial institutions, they might have international consequences, which maybe like this, the severance, the severance of the correspondent banking relationships, right? So you should, when you conduct your own risk assessment, obviously informed by this risk assessment, by this PF risk assessment, you should include the consequences into that, right? As part of your methodology. That's just what I wanted to say. Yeah. Okay.
I just want to add just for the DNFBPs, and we'll go further into that. The DNFBPs specifically, and the other bucket, as Elias was explaining, is mostly in the UAE context. It's the real estate agents and accountants, right? So the FATF describes lawyers, accountants, and company service providers as gatekeepers, which means that you are providing information from your clients, and you are also representing them. And so a lot of times, this is an important measure of in not just for PF, for others, trade finance, etc., in terms of your role and responsibilities, in terms of risk and how the country has to mitigate those risks and address those risks. So while in the context of PF, these threats and vulnerabilities you may not be directly exposed to them, you're indirectly exposed to them through your clients, but nonetheless, your roles are extremely important in this risk assessment, and that's why when we go more into the outcomes, when EOCN describes the outcomes, you will see how those risks are scored and evaluated accordingly.
Thank you, Ladan and Elias, for starting the presentation. So we'll talk more about the outcomes of the UAE PF NRA. Since Ladan already mentioned all the threat factors, all the risk factors, everything into account, we'll talk what the UAE is assessed in terms of all of these factors. So first of all, in terms of inherent risk, as Ladan mentioned, it's a calculation of the weighted threats across all the different sectors. They mentioned FIs, DNFPPs, and VASPs, and the weighted vulnerabilities. You add them up together and you get the inherent risk. So for the UAE, it's, the risk rating is high, and this is because of many different factors. The first one being is the geographic risk. The UAE is very close to countries with PF concern, namely Iran and mainly Iran. And the UAE is also a very big trade and transshipment hub, so a lot of volume flows into the UAE, which leads for concern and increases the risk of the UAE. Another threat factor or another reason the risk is high is that cybercrime and virtual assets are used by DPRK and other PF actors to support their WMD and proliferation financing. And this can be accessible from anywhere, so this gives us a total, this adds up to the high rating which we inherently have in the UAE. And lastly, the ease of setting up and doing business in the UAE leads to a lot of companies establishing front companies, which is also a main typology in terms of PF cases. So after that, after calculating the inherent risk, we take into effect the mitigating controls of the UAE. And mainly the mitigating controls in the UAE are partially effective. This is due to the laws and cabinet decisions and other efforts in the UAE are mainly new. So it's very hard to address and become really effective in the start of the journey. So because of how recently these efforts were implemented, the mitigating control in the UAE is rated for an overall country risk as partially effective. So finally, the residual risk, after calculating, after minusing the inherent risk with the mitigating control, we get the residual risk in the UAE, which is an overall residual risk for the country as being medium-high. So in terms of diving into your sectors, firstly, we'll talk about the DPMS sector. So the inherent risk for the DPMS sector is very high because of a lot of things, one of them being cross-border smuggling of cash, another being the relative liquidity of these assets, and then transferring them to financial products, or liquidating gold is very, or other precious metals and so on is very easy, and then including them in the financial system, which makes it inherently a very high risk area. Another main reason is mainly these shops have very basic compliance functions, so it's very hard to really get these compliance issues solved compared to FIs and bigger DNFPPs that have a dedicated team, dedicated compliance units, and it's mainly easier to regulate these sectors than the gold and other shops, because there are a lot of variety in these shops, and it's very hard to control each and every one of them. So another reason that the DPMS is inherently risky is that we've seen a lot of UN POEs about the DPMS sector, and a lot of reports internationally about how cash is used to fund proliferation financing activities, actors, and even networks. So for the residual risk in the UAE, it's medium-high because of the actions the supervisory authorities took, mainly the Ministry of Economy. They regulated the threshold for cash and the need for identification in a certain threshold, which results in a lower residual risk rating. So in terms of the other DNFPPs, we have company service providers, lawyers, and other accountants. So these three sectors inherently are medium-high. They are less exposed to, or they're less than the DPMS sector, since they're exposed to these risks only secondarily through their through other clients or through other. They don't engage directly with financial products or services, so they're not inherently high-risk areas. Also, company service providers and lawyers are mainly responsible for establishing front companies and shell companies, which still leads them into being high-risk areas. So for residual risk, for residual risk for company service providers and lawyers, because of the reasons we mentioned, they're still medium-high. Because of the ease of them exposing or establishing front companies and shell companies, which is a very big PF threat. And then these companies can engage directly with proliferation-sensitive goods, dual-use goods. And like the UAE has made good efforts to reduce this risk. However, namely the national registry that the Ministry of Economy worked on to ultimately show the beneficial ownership of every company. But this effort is relatively also new, so it's very hard to have an effect on the residual risk rating as of yet. So this is why these two, the company service providers and the lawyers, remain at a medium-high risk. So for other DNFPPs, their inherent risk is lowered because their exposure to these products and financial services are not direct. They're only exposed to them through their clients. So this helps us with giving them a lower rating, since they are very easy to control and mitigate. So this concludes all the DNFPP sector. We'll talk more about the main threats that affected in these risk ratings. So as Ladan mentioned, we have three main threats. First of all, financial products or services directly related to trade and proliferation-sensitive goods. Since the DNFPPs don't deal with this directly, it doesn't have much of an impact on them. However, the second and third revenue-raising activities and financial corporate structure to support the movement and finance of cash, the DNFPP sectors engage in them more directly and have a higher risk to these areas. So when we calculated the inherent threat to get, or when we calculated the threat to get the inherent risk, these were the main weights we took in, even though the financial products or services has the most weight out of the three threats. The two revenue raising and financial corporate sector took most of the weightage in these sectors. So for vulnerabilities, we have mainly 5 vulnerabilities, but the ones we want to focus on are the first 3, the geographic and environmental factors, the legal persons and arrangement, and the legal and institutional factors. As Ladan mentioned, like these are how we calculated the inherent risk for each sector, and we believe that for the DNFPPs, these are the main areas of concern in regards to them. So for mitigating effectiveness, we have the UAE has a strong and effective political commitment to adhere to these TFS, obligations and reduce the risk of PF. Also, law enforcement and judicial authorities have effective measures in investigating and prosecuting PF cases and combating sanction evasion. However, this is with the exception of the VASP sector, where the level of effectiveness in these investigations and prosecutions is kind of considered new and hard to deal with. So this is only partially effective. So thirdly, we have the national and international cooperation This is effective in terms of the UAE's regard for exchanging information in regards to PF, but internationally or international cooperation channels that are like in terms of judicial between two countries is only partially effective, since most of the cooperation took between allies, which is also known as informal channels. So for formal channels, the UAE is only considered partially effective, but it is effective in the field of like generally exchanging information. So the second slide shows that the study also revealed export control authorities are only partially effective in detecting PF-sensitive goods and cross-border movable money. The central bank and the financial institutions supervisory authorities have effective supervisory procedures for FIs, but the effectiveness for VASPs and the NFPPs is considered partially effective. The procedures and measures taken in registering and registration and company formation is effective for FIs, but also partially effective for VASPs and the NFPPs. So this gives you guys a bit of insight on why the ratings were how they are in terms of the mitigating measures, the inherent risk, and the residual risk. So we mentioned a lot of reasons, and we'll dive more into the recommendations on how to improve this for the next round, and what the areas we managed to find as high-risk areas, and what we want to help in reducing them by. So for the first couple of recommendations, is mainly want to improve the compliance with PF obligations in accordance with FATF standards and international best practices and local guidance. So we can do this in mainly 4 ways. Amending AML-CFT laws to require reporting entities to conduct institutional PF risk assessments and have in place trade-based illicit finance and CPF compliance programs. Require PF-specific CDD, KYC, EDD criteria to be added to the reporting entities and to level onboarding requirements across all sectors. Ensure LFIs and other relevant reporting entities have timely, accurate, and up-to-date UBO information. So this would be aided by the National Register coming in place. And finally, providing updated PF guidance to reporting entities based on findings from this report. So the final recommendation is mainly on us to update our guidance, so the private sector and other reporting entities can use these in their own companies and institutions. So secondly, the main recommendation we have is to to enhance CDD and KYC to incorporate these red flags for PF and account for PF-related exposures. So we need to increase the PF red flags awareness among all reporting entities and the GoAML RFRs instead of reporting STRs. And increase the awareness between the difference of submitting the PNMRs and FFRs and SARs and STRs. So now there's quite a discrepancy in the companies that do understand the PNMR and FFRs and want to submit them, and the SARs and STRs, which we are currently working on, and the report also aided in this finding. So finally, we'll talk about the expectations from the EOCN and the private sector to mitigate the risk. So first of all, requirements, we are hoping to share the summary of the main threats and vulnerabilities in a sanitized version so that the private sector can understand these risks and implement them in their institutions based on the threats that affect them most. And finally, we want to encourage them to incorporate the outcomes of the executive summary. As I said, we want to share these findings so that these companies can identify the high-risk areas and finally deal with them in their own way. Since like every company would have a different risk appetite and a different risk profile, so the main national risk assessment will give an outcome about the whole country, and then each company would, based on their own internal procedures and policies, implement them in their own way. So for next step, the OCN is conducting a lot of training sessions to increase the awareness on these results, to help the private sector again implement these policies internally. So for private sector, after understanding these risks and the NRA in general, we'd like them to conduct internal training for their employees, specifically in trade finance and dual-use goods, where we found that a relevant amount of threat and we would say like the understanding of these issues are commonly less than other AML or common issues. So trade finance and dual-use goods are less aware, and especially in a lot of different DNFPP sectors. So this is what we're trying to aim for in the future, and this is where we're going. So this concludes our session. We'll take any questions if you have any, or if Ladan or Elias or maybe David would like to add something. I'll give the floor to you guys.
No, I mean, I believe we have I believe we have an audience online, but I don't know if they're going to be able to ask questions online, right?
I'm not sure, actually. No, I don't think they will. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if anybody here has any questions. Yeah, otherwise.
A couple of things about, again, your specific sector and the mitigating controls and measures. The DNFBP sector, and the reason this is the only session that is online or streamed, is because it's a huge, I think about 29,000 or something, 21,000, 20,000, 21,000, what's 1,000 between friends? That many entities and groups under DNFBPs. And except for lawyers, everybody else is supervised and regulated by the Department of the Ministry of Economy, and the lawyers are under the Ministry of Justice. Prior to about a year and a half ago, also lawyers were being supervised or regulated by the Ministry of Economy, and in terms of PF, this is all new to the sector in general, all DNFBPs, to take into account PF risk. So some of the factors that went into rating or scoring or rating DNFBP sector as high as it is comes to that, down to that. Now, one of the groups, DPMSs, dealers in precious metals and stones, and primarily gold dealers, are rated the highest. And that is because when we were talking about the threats and the weight of it, we said that half of it was trade-related in PF-sensitive goods, had the highest weights versus revenue-raising activities and corporate structures that facilitate use of cash, the third category. Whereas lawyers, accountants, and other DNFBPs, real estate agents, are not as involved in the trade products. Gold and DPMS providers, gold is a cash equivalent. So that is, unlike other DNFBPs, those are the ones that are used in trade as well, because it's, again, a cash equivalent product. So when you have a sector that is rated high, it means that it's high in all those categories, whereas with other DNFBPs, they're not as involved in trade or not even directly, but they are facilitators when it comes, or the role can facilitate the use or the revenue raising for other activities through their clients. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of how that was assessed. And in this case, it's not just the UAE that is this way, it's across the world. You will find that DPMSs in general will present a higher exposure to and higher risk rating in terms of trade finance in general. And in terms of the UAE, because of its unique position, both as a trade and transshipment hub, as well as its geographic location, where some of this gold activity is, and these are reports that are international that have been done, that shows that it has ended up as as you were saying, in terms of the UNPOE reports that have been specifically mentioning gold and gold dealers, gold that comes from even Africa through here, other countries in the proximity through here, for those activities where it finances proliferation goods. That is why that role is important. The other thing I wanted to mention is in terms of the novelty of proliferation financing for this sector in general, the mitigating controls are also new, and as I mentioned before, the sheer numbers of entities that the Ministry of Economy has to oversee and supervise and regulate makes it inherently difficult for them to capture all of that and to be able to make sure that this is all done properly and that you understand your roles. But I think within roles and responsibilities, I have to say, but with these kinds of workshops and information and guidance that is provided by both EOCN and hopefully Ministry of Economy, that'll become easier for you to be able to incorporate that into your own work. And I'm hoping same with the Ministry of Justice, which I was going to say, that was, while it was new in between when we started the data and information gathering and when we finished and analyzed the data, Ministry of Justice was just coming into looking at the role of lawyers as company service providers and assessing their risk and their exposure when it comes to proliferation financing. And then there's also the roles of lawyers as well as accountants and others in company formation. Even the UAE is not just a trade hub, it's also a transshipment hub, which presents a huge risk. I've always said that whatever shipment cargo comes inside the UAE, United Arab Emirates, there are various entities and authorities who ensure that as much as they can, this product or the cargo is safe or that is regulated by the correct entity. The problem is the huge amount of transshipment that goes through, and a bunch of these front companies that even are like open warehouses in various of the CFCs that receive these products and have no idea where they are, where they're going. And then there's also the shipping practices that have made it inherently difficult with the huge amount of shipping that goes through the Strait of Hormuz to be able to really, truly identify all these risks and be able to mitigate them and provide the amount of export control that is equivalent to the amount of risk and the amount of cargo and shipment that goes through the strait.
I want to add something. Hi, I am Bursar Al-Awar. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Bushra Al-Awar from the Executive Office for Control and Non-Proliferation. I just want to add, so as my colleagues discussed the result of the PFNRA, so now you have to incorporate these results in your institutional PF risk assessment, and we expect you to do so. You can go to our website and you will find the guidance how to do the institutional PF risk assessment. So I just wanted to add this point. And also, we will have other, inshallah, training and workshops. So this is just the beginning. This is an ongoing training for the PFNRA. So we expect you to incorporate these results in your institutional PF risk assessment. Thank you.
Well, you beat me to it. I was going to say that. So yeah, some of you who are watching online or here might ask yourselves, so why is the PFNRA important to me or important to my business? As it was already mentioned here and there, it's basically to improve your understanding of what are the risks, where the risks emanate from, what are the main threats, and what are most importantly, the vulnerabilities that you encounter in your sector, not the DNFBP sector, but in your own sector. If you're a DPMS, if you're a TCSP, if you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, etc. What are this report contains valuable information to see where are your weaknesses, maybe your gaps, your deficiencies, and more importantly, this will help you tailor your policies, procedures, and controls in your own risk assessment to be able to identify and mitigate the actual risk that are intrinsic to the business that you're involved with, right? So this is a very important part. Also, an important thing to mention is, next year, at the end of next year, is going to be the UAE is going to be submitted to the fifth round of mutual evaluation processes by the FATF, and you're going to be subject to the mutual evaluation report. With the new methodology, the fifth round methodology has an increase focused on risk and context. So it is very important, as the previous MER noted, an uneven understanding of the AML, CFT, and CPF risks, especially within the DNFBP sector. So the most important definitely will be for you to tailor and enhance your controls and your programs to mitigate these risks. But also when the FATF come, you have to be very, very aware of what are the risks, right? Because it is very important that you all have an even understanding of your money laundering, terrorist financing, but also the proliferation financing risks, right? So this exercise has this double purpose, right? That's what I wanted to say. Maybe Dave over there?
And just for the FATF purposes, while it seems to be a long time away, the summer of 2026, in a lot of ways it's right around the corner. I think both the authorities and the private sector are incredibly well positioned are going to be incredibly well positioned for that exercise, having gone through the ICRG process and the coaching that accompanied that, and there will be more. But I think, especially with reference to PF, this is a great first step to get your awareness overall of the threats, the mitigants, and the vulnerabilities that are in place, the overall risk levels associated with PF specifically to your sectors, and there will be ample coaching in advance of the mutual evaluation on the way to the next 2 years to that event.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that even the threats or the mitigating controls we talked about were enacted in the beginning of the year or late 2023, when we actually saw them in the report, they were even before that. So it was very hard to, even with a 6-month or 1-year period, to assess the effectiveness. So we implemented these a while ago, and we're starting training now. So when the assessors come in 2025 or 2026, our sectors already know their risks, our laws are already effective, and everything is in place to have a good next round for evaluation. So this is why we're starting now. This is why we're doing everything in advance to be more than prepared and to have excellent results. So the last time we ended up on the grey list, this time we want to end up with great results instead of the grey list. So yeah, that's it.
And thanks. I just wanted to add, especially with this group, the purpose of the institutional risk assessment, I deal with private sector and other capacity. And when you go up to them and say, have you done your risk assessment? They're like, yeah, we did it, it's over there. Or we hired some consultant who did our risk assessment, it's sitting on some shelf somewhere. But the point of the risk assessment is, and the whole point of the FATF recommendations is to take a risk-based approach to your controls. So this national risk assessment is telling you that the inherent risk, the raw risk, the unmitigated risk that the country faces is pretty high. Just by the mere presence, your mere presence here, operating in this country, because of where it's located and all the other risks involved in it, it is a high amount of risk. And we've shown you that the residual risk at the national level, where it is for each of your sectors. What you will do for yourself is to look at it and say, well, these are the risks from what when you'll see the actual printed version of the PFNRA, when you see it, you see these are the trade finance related stuff. This either applies to me or doesn't, or how am I exposed to this? And then look at the revenue raising risks and those typologies there, the red flag indicators, how much is your exposure? And your risk assessment should be able to tell you that. And from that, you can see where you can apply your resources to control those risks, to address them. And whether you want to find those risks, I always talk about, like in terms of geographies, et cetera, some company might decide that they're not going to deal with certain countries, or they're not going to deal with vendors from certain products, or they're no longer going to have these kinds of services. That may be your risk tolerance. Or you decide that you are going to take on that risk, but you're going to devote a higher amount of resources to addressing that risk. So that's what your risk assessment is going to do for you, is to help you manage your business in a way that's more efficient and best suited, so that you can do your business with the best amount of, best equipped to deal with those risks. It's not just so that, the next time that FATF comes around, you have a good answer. It's to help you conduct your business and your livelihood in an atmosphere that you are faced with these kinds of risks at the national level, and so you can better conduct your business to be more efficient and to deal with those risks. But at the national level, we do care about how the country is presented, and how it's, with all the work that at the national level we've been working, we've had the honor, as I said, working with the EOCN, but other authorities too, and the UAE has expended a lot of effort in supervision, in law enforcement, in judicial avenues and everything, in terms of enforcement and implementation, to make sure that the country is very well represented, and it does have a way of meeting and exceeding the expectations in addressing all the risks in the country and at all levels. But right now, and the other thing is that this is the UAE is one of the first few countries who have conducted a standalone PF national risk assessment and have done a great job at it. And so next time, the results and the outcome, and it's a very honest look at the UAE's, and a very objective look at the UAE's risks, and it's both inherent and residual risk. And in the next couple of years, as more mitigating measures and controls are going to be in effect, we think, as you said, and when the next one is conducted, both PF as well as other risks, the UAE will have, is better equipped to address those risks, I think.
Okay, we'll take some questions if anyone has any.
Thank you. I'm Raad Rawati from the Executive Office for Control and Non-Proliferation. There is a question from the participants online. So there's a question, is it enough to just to screen regarding the UN list or US list, or does the private sector should have or take other measures in order to mitigate the PF risks within their institutions? So if there is any advice for the private sector, what they can use, what the areas they should look at, and any other advice that you can give to private sector?
First, I would say that if next time anybody asks a question, please let us know which sector at least you're from. But also, I think they're going to talk about how you're going to. This is the first, as you said, in terms of risk assessments, but in terms of guidance, you can tell them, I don't know if there's any on the specific sector, but the short answer to lists for sanctions is not is not enough. But are you going to talk more about that?
Yeah, so in terms of screening for sanctions lists, this may be applicable to TF cases, but for PF cases, in terms of PF cases, there are many other restricted goods such as chemical weapons or chemical items or other strategic goods and dual-use goods. So just screening for names in any list is not enough in terms of PF risk assessments. You need to have an understanding about the HS codes, about the different restricted items, where they come from, and if the ultimate or the final address is here in the UAE or is it if it's in another country, is that country sanctioned or not? You need to understand a couple of different things, not just names on a list for PF-related issues.
Do you have a guidance on? And I think the other thing is, there is a guidance, and in terms of sanctions in general, you look at the who, what, where. Those are that applies to sanctions. The who, in terms of who is this for, the originator and the destination. What is the cargo? What is it that you are looking at? As if in this case it's usually trade finance, or if it's in terms of revenue, what is it for? And then, as you said, it's not just the product that you're looking at, you're going to see if it makes sense for that business. So dual-use goods means that it can be used for civilian purposes, or it can be used for military purposes, or other purposes. So you have the list of dual-use goods, there are also prohibited goods, and there could be, when you look at the route that this cargo took, if you are very unclear in terms of where it came from, or where it's going, that in and of itself is a red flag. If there are various changes in ownership, if you don't know the ultimate beneficial ownership of the owner or where the product is going, or if the product itself doesn't make sense in terms of the business of your client or its end user, that's another thing you need to look at. So there's various things to be looked at in terms of sanctions that just doesn't, just looking at a list, screening against a list is not going to suffice.
And, if I may add just one thing. I mean, it is no secret that the state of the UN Security Council resolutions, could be improved, to say the least, right? What has happened with Iran and what is happening with North Korea. So to answer directly your question, if you want to be exactly compliant with the standards and with the FATF standards, yes, screen only what the UN Security Council resolutions have. But I think that at the stage we're in, we have already superseded those standards. It is not enough for companies, for financial institutions, and for DNFBPs to only constrain themselves on what the UN and the list of the UN Security Council resolutions. You have to take a broader approach, a more robust and more comprehensive approach, because we're not living in a silo. We're living in a broader world with consequences. For example, in addition to the UN Security Council resolutions list, here in the UAE you have their own local designations, right? The countries surrounding the UAE have also their own designations. And you know that there are many, also financial hubs around the world. I mean, just to mention a few, the United States, the EU, the UK, Canada, Australia, they all have their own sanctions framework, very comprehensive sanctions framework. So if you want to be compliant with the realities of the world, then I would suggest that you screen for all of the components that we're saying, not only the persons, the entities, but also the goods, the W's goods, the HS codes, etc. Yes.
I just want to add one point, that the local list is also an obligation.
Yeah.
The UN and the local list, not just the UN. Just wanted to fix this.
Thank you, Bushra. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Fatuna Jassam from the Executive Office of Control and Non-Proliferation. So I just wanted to add on Slayem, Bushra, and Ilyas and Ladan point is that as per the TFS obligations in regards to targeted financial sanctions and the screening is that the obligation as per the Cabinet resolution is on the UN consolidated list and the UAE local terrorist list.
The CDD from which PF concerns might emerge or other suspicions may emerge, which may not be readily apparent as related to proliferation finance, but may appear to be suspicions or related to other financial crime and your reporting obligations. And quite often, many of the reports that are tied to proliferation finance often go in as being flagged for, let's say, trade-based money laundering because the typologies may appear the same, but ultimately those reports are getting to the FIU, and from the FIU they're curated and evaluated and then being passed to law enforcement that can further carry out the investigative activities to vet those suspicions, ultimately either finding no merit or investigating them further, eventually potentially for prosecution. And just on the domestic list, if I'm not mistaken, Fatuna, it's just for the domestic list is just for TF under UN Resolution 1373.
Correct.
However, many of the groups involved in this region may also have links to PF networks as well, and have and whether their financing ends in themselves are maybe to generate revenue for their groups, they're also funding PF networks and proliferators in the process.
That's actually correct, David. And just on what you said, also what I wanted to add is that in terms of the suspicious and the reportings, especially with the DNFPP sector here, it's very important for them to differentiate between the activities where they need to report where there is actually a sanctioned person, where there is a designation and they need to report a partial name match report or a fund freezing report or a confirmed, such as even cases where there is a confirmed match in that sense, as opposed to the suspicious activity reports and STRs that would have, for example, cases of proliferation financing suspicions, and the other thing is that inquiring about the permits, if it is relevant to your business, if it's relevant to what you're doing, inquiring about the required permits by the entities that they need to acquire from the EOCN in terms of permits and dual-use good items. So just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
When you're talking about screening also, and going back to what, expounding on what David was talking about, we're talking about screening, transaction monitoring, transaction screening, as well as customer CDD KYC, onboarding and ongoing customer screening. So these kinds of things that's why I was asking who is asking, what industry you're in, because that's different for each. And I think as we go on, there's going to be more training and workshops that would give you more information on that. But I think that's, and I think I don't know if the Ministry of Economy has provided any guidance in terms of, I know that EOCN has, and I don't know for each of these sectors they have, but it's a different issue. I mean, for accountants, that's a very different issue versus lawyers and DPMS, et cetera. And I know that you're starting to put in more and more controls into that.
Okay, I think we can close the session if there are no more questions. Okay, there's...
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gopal. I'm from the DPMS sector. So my question is regarding if you see the DPMS sector, it has multiple entities. As they were saying, there are almost 29,000 entities within the DPMS sector. Why don't we have subsectors? Like, for example, you've got gold refineries, you've got gold shops, which are a part of the gold souk, and then we form part of DPMS, we are retailers of watches and jewelry. Now, this segment is completely different from the gold refineries or the gold shops or the jewelry shops. So it becomes very difficult for us to really match, you can say, the due diligence processes or the amount of enhanced due diligence that has to be applied when we are considered as the same sector with gold refineries and gold and jewelry shops. So why can't we have subsectors?
To be said earlier, like each entity knows its risk, knows how it's affected by its risk, and if it's dealing directly or indirectly with these consequences. However, like since you guys maybe are not dealing with these proliferation financing activities directly, you're exposed to less risk. However, there is still a secondary exposure, there is still secondary risk. There is there are some typologies where individuals buy high value goods, which they can then travel with and then sell abroad and finally, fund these PF actors or networks. So even though you're not directly exposed to these risks, you need to have a good understanding so that if you would come to any of these cases, you would know how to deal with them, how to report them, and how to prevent these cases from, or prevent the consequences as Elias was talking about. So,
and just and speaking about the methodology, we had this conversation before, right? You have your refiners, your smelters, your importers and exporters, bullion, retail. Yes, everything was considered into the risk assessment, but through a high-level overview. This is not a sectoral risk assessment of the DPMS sector. This is a national risk assessment on proliferation financing. So if you would like, for example, to further understand where the primary risks are in each of your, let's say, sub-industries on the DPMS sector, then a sectoral risk assessment should be conducted by the appropriate authorities, I'm guessing the MOE in this case, that actually goes and finds information, well, finds things about you and about your sector to be able to pinpoint and to, detect where the risks emanate and how to best mitigate it, right?
And actually, the person who was representing the DPMS specifically mentioned this, and it's one of the recommendations that we have for the MOE to conduct a sectoral risk assessment and divide that group. And we do understand that the bullions are the highest. The retailers in gold bullion are the highest in terms of risk, and the retailers have different, and since we conducted the risk assessment, we were informed that there's more of a CDD KYC that's happening on the retail level. So we understand that, and not just this session. There were others who were saying they wanted sectoral risk assessments done, and that's up to the specific supervisory and regulatory authorities to do that. And just one correction, the 29,000 entities are not DPMS, they're DNFBPs. All accountants, lawyers, real estate agents, DPMSs and everything, those are the entities that the MOE has to regulate and supervise, not just the DPMSs.
Just one more thing to add to what my colleague said up there is that also from there's the requirement to conduct CDD KYC for the DPMS sector has a threshold there that is set because depending on the risks of the entity and depending on for example the amounts that are transactions, and this differentiates the retailers from the bullion traders. This is one thing. Again, as Saleem said also, the this was considered during the assessment, the differences between the subsectors in the DPMS. And as we said, there are some factors or some threats, especially on the high-value goods. Sorry, the high-value goods that might be, used, or let's say it's a vulnerability here, given also the use of cash that's easily that we can easily trade it for high good values or high-value goods and the retailers and the DPMS sector. So.
If I could, and to Fatun's point about the threshold, the 55,000 AED threshold for one transaction or what appear to be a series of linked transactions where all the AML CFT obligations kick in. But your clients as a retailer may be much simpler than your clients if you're, let's say, a refinery onboarding a mine. So the levels of due diligence to essentially find out who that ultimate beneficial ownership is, it could be for a retailer much simpler when engaging in those those retail transactions than other sectors. So I think it's like the risk it's like assessing risk. It's like the systems that you're supposed to have in place. They're tailored to the risks that you face.
Thank you.
Okay. So, is there any other question? We could clear maybe something up. Okay. Can you tell us which sector you're from? Okay.
Hi. So I'm from the company service provider registered in DIFC, supervised by the DFSA. My question is around the EOCN permit. Now, at what stage does the registrar or a licensing activity allow the firms to apply for a permit, and until what time the permit is valid? It just happens so that we have a current situation where a client is looking to set up an entity. Obviously, there's dual good use. And as part of our onboarding, we're trying to assess who's going to be their buyers, suppliers, what are the countries they're going to be exporting, importing, etc. Part of that, I understand that permit is one important aspect. But again, is that something the registrars mandated, or is that something the entity will have to separately apply for it?
So the entity would have to separately apply for it. They would need to sign up on the EOCN permit website and apply for a permit as soon as the shipment comes in. So then, depending on the dual-use item or depending on the internal due diligence the EOCN will conduct, it will then, after a couple of days, conduct the permit. Sometimes inspections will happen, sometimes. So it's based on a lot of different stuff, but it's when the shipment comes in, it's then referred to the EOCN for a permit to enter the country. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. If there are maybe some online questions we can take, if we have the. Okay. So thank you for participating. Thank you everyone for showing up. We hope everything is clear. So expect a sanitized version shortly, which will help you conduct your institutional risk assessments and factor in all these risks to your relevant entities. And you can always visit the EOCN website for more information regarding anything. We have some videos on YouTube, some publications, some guidelines. So anything that is still maybe unclear in your heads or you think about later, you can always refer back to the website, and hopefully it will be clear after searching through the guidelines. Thank you everyone. Thank you K2 for helping us out. And yeah, that's it. Thank you everybody.